Dr. Judson Brewer, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
By my count, this is your 6th appearance on this show, so you are among the most frequent of frequent flyers.
Wow, I didn't think it was that many. I'm honored and blushing.
We have a loyalty rewards program, so you should be getting some free shit.
Great, I love free shit.
All right, well, we're talking today about addiction. I'm always a little wary of that word just because one of my obsessions is making every episode of this podcast as applicable to as broad an audience as possible. And I think there are many people who think, well, I'm not an addict, and they're imagining something quite extreme. But I believe your argument is, we're all addicted to something, if not many things.
Yes, and we can think of these as everyday addictions. Maybe it's the easiest way to think about that is the definition of addiction that I learned in residency, which is continued use despite adverse consequences. And so folks can just let that settle in, continued use despite adverse consequences. So are there times when we are tempted to be scrolling on our phone instead of listening to our partner, for example, when we're having a conversation? Are there times when we are pulled to check our text message that somebody just texted us while we're driving? So I think it's more of a continuum than a kind of an all or none quantal. Yes, I'm an addict or I'm an addicted person versus no, I'm not. And I don't know anybody that can't relate to having adverse consequences from something that they've been pulled to do, at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking back through my life. I mean, I think I've had some addictions that are pretty far along on the spectrum, away from everyday, but for sure plenty of everyday. For the listeners, I mean, it can be everything from your relationship to your phone to maybe just drinking a little bit too much alcohol or coffee. We're at the end of January here, so people may have been attempting dry January with the alcohol. So there are just so many things that the mind can cling to and crave.
Well, it's built off of these basic survival mechanisms. It's helpful to crave food when we're hungry. It's helpful to avoid danger when it's staring us in the face. So those are very basic survival mechanisms. And in modern day, people know this, and so they can design addictive experiences so they can leverage those brain pathways to get us hooked. In this attention economy is one of the big things, trying to get us hooked on paying attention to their stuff so they can sell us ideas or literal things.
Right. So we have a world in which we have these ancient brains that were wired with reasonably good reason to crave the pleasant and be aversive vis-a-vis the unpleasant. And then we've created a modern infrastructure that is jabbing at these ancient impulses nonstop.
Absolutely.
Is there a difference between, and I ask you this as a scientist and also, and I'm going to use this word, but I don't know if you would agree with it, but I would say a scientist and a Buddhist, or at least a Buddhist practitioner or a meditation practitioner. Is there a difference between the way science understands addiction and the way Buddhism does?
As far as I can tell, and this is a question that I've been literally studying for over 20 years now, I haven't found any differences or even discrepancies. So, my lab, if you go back to the Buddhist psychology, I started testing, taking pieces of that and testing it as hypotheses because, this guy was a lot smarter than I am. So it's like, well, why not take these things, create careful scientific experiments around them and see if they're true in modern day? And it turns out that every single one that he put forward has been not just true, but really eye-opening. For example, taking, our first randomized controlled trial with trying to help people quit smoking. And I love this because people are like, no way, there's no way you can do this. And that's what gets me excited to try something where instead of using the standard practices and techniques that I'd been taught in residency and medical school and all of that to help people quit smoking, which is largely cognitive, I instead followed the Buddha's instruction, which was, explore gratification to its end. And that was an interesting one. We can get into it in more detail if that's helpful, but basically we tested that by having people pay attention when they smoke cigarettes, and we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. And even predicted that, craving doesn't necessarily just vanish when you change a behavior. It dies down over time when you stop fueling it. And even some of the language, the Buddhist language, like these 12 links of dependent origination, you look at craving, tanha, thirst, leads to the next link, which is, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, but I would pronounce it upadana, which often is translated as clinging, and some translate it as sustenance or fuel. And so if you think of smoking a cigarette, that provides the fuel for a future round of craving. And if you stop adding that fuel to the fire, it eventually burns down. And I was actually just last weekend speaking with a Buddhist scholar who was talking about nirvana, literally meaning, the fire goes out.
The extinguishing.
Yes. So I haven't found it. Not only have I not found discrepancies, and we've even published papers showing the links, where I've worked with Buddhist scholars and teachers, where we've written papers showing how these are basically the, different language for the same thing. We haven't found a single thing that has been contradictory yet, which is pretty cool.
It's really cool. I mean, it does go to emphasize, assuming we can stipulate that the Buddha was an actual person, because there's so much, nothing was really written down at the time when he allegedly lived, but assuming we can stipulate that he was an actual person, rather than this being an accumulation of learnings that grew out of a multi-person tradition, the dude was a genius.
And Goenka called him, so S.N. Goenka, this, very famous Buddhist teacher who I think he taught mostly in India. Is he born in India? Something like that. So, and has these Vipassana centers all over the world now. He died, a few years ago. He called the Buddha a super scientist, and so he was even highlighting this scientific approach that the Buddha took to exploring his own experience. And just to zoom in on that for a minute, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. It wasn't about these deep states of concentration or these, magical powers that the Buddha, was allegedly had developed. It was about contemplating his own experience. It was the dependent origination piece of his experience that actually led to his enlightenment. And so it highlights these causal nature of experience that, and just kind of living into it and understanding it fully, that's what apparently led to his awakening.
Can you define dependent origination for people who are new to that term?
No, I don't know. I think of it as these. It's a great question. Ask ChatGPT. It's so I can say that there are a fair number of suttas written in the Pali Canon about these links of causality. And so I think of it pragmatically, as the title suggests, dependent origination. When this exists because of this is kind of some of the way that the suttas talk about it. And so you can think of, craving leads to clinging. Without craving, there is no clinging, so to speak. And so he was really describing this causal nature of experience, and that these 12 links actually go in a cycle that was described as samsara, or endless wandering, because when we're caught up in that cycle, we perpetuate our beliefs, our story, and even the story of the self, which, as every time we spin that wheel, we suffer. I'll just mention one other thing, because this Buddhist scholar blew my mind this last weekend, where we were talking about the words for dukkha and sukha. And, often dukkha is translated as suffering. I think that's one of the most common, modern day translations I've heard. I don't know if you've heard differently. He was talking about, so the ka is common, right? Dukkha, sukha. And he said ka is a little hard to translate, but it's kind of like space, but it's not really. It's like the everythingness. And dukkha means contracted space, for lack of a better way of putting it. And sukha is not like the opposite. It's the negation of contraction.
Yeah.
Because we're in a non-dual experience, we're not moving into something else that's expanded. We are just uncontracting. Think of it as the sphincter tone becomes a little less tight.
Well, I love that. So dukkha, which in Buddhism is often translated as suffering, or sometimes unsatisfactoriness, that, the Buddha said life is dukkha or life is suffering, but I think it doesn't mean like everything sucks all the time. It just means that things are going to be bumpy and unsatisfactory if you're constantly clinging to things that won't last in a universe that's characterized by change and impermanence. And sukha, I don't know exactly what the translation of that is, like happiness, or
I've heard it translated as bliss, PT. Yeah. So let's say bliss, happiness. I've heard it translated as that, but that's very different. Unsatisfactoriness is very different than contracted space.
Yes.
Experientially. And I think that's important. I could be wrong. Happy to be wrong.
So contracted space is, I heard this term recently, an involution. Like it's like a something that keeps turning in on itself, a downward spiral that keeps turning in on itself. To put that in plain English, it's when you have your head up your ass.
Yes.
You are just wrapped up in your shit, and so that's dukkha. Sukha is taking your head out of your ass and seeing the lack of division between you and the world. That
I would agree with that. And I would, to extend this longer than it needs to be extended, think of it as being a tight ass, right? So when somebody is really attached to something, whether it's money or an idea or their, some ego-filled thing, you can think of it as being a tight ass, right? Head up their ass, tight ass type of thing. Totally agree. I bring that tight part in because that's where the contracted fits perfectly.
And that is different. You're saying it's important to distinguish between this, to extend the scatological, or to keep beating this dead horse of the scatological metaphor.
The shitty metaphor, yes.
Exactly. As having your head up your ass or being contracted is different from unsatisfactoriness. You said that before. And so maybe see a little bit more about why you think that's such an important distinction.
It adds clarity, and it also makes things, as a result, makes things more pragmatic. We can really have it's so straightforward to check to see when we're feeling contracted. Whereas unsatisfactoriness is very vague. And there could be things that are unsatisfactory that are not necessarily causing suffering in the same way. There can be dis-ease that's not necessarily a problem. Think of that first arrow that the Buddha talks about where there's pain or whatever. We add to that pain with that second arrow where we shoot ourselves. Shoot ourselves in the foot or in the ass. Sorry. And that part is optional, whereas the reality is what it is. The world's going to be a certain way. There are most things we don't have control over, but if we contract around the way the things are, we're more likely to suffer. So to me, it's a little more straightforward. And maybe I've just always been confused by, help me understand exactly what unsatisfactoriness means and how that draws a straight line to suffering. That's been a struggle, but with the contraction piece makes a lot more sense. And also, I've talked about before, like it lines up with my neuroimaging studies. It lines up with some of the newer research we've done around, mental states that are associated with contraction versus mental states associated with expansion, the opposite, or the letting go. And so it pragmatically just fits more easily into the puzzle than unsatisfactoriness, at least for me.
It's possible I'm being a dum-dum or I'm forgetting something you've already said. Both of those descriptions are operative on the regular. But can you remind me how this discussion that we just had about expansion versus contraction relates back to addiction?
So think of addiction being one of the ultimate contractions. If you think of the primary neurotransmitters associated with addiction. And again, it's complex. I'm not saying this, I don't want to oversimplify it, but dopamine, for example, has been linked most often to addiction. Dopamine is a motivation molecule, and we have to kind of get all coiled up, sprung up, contracted in order to go do the thing, because that's what it's there for. If we're hungry, we're going to have a craving for food, and we're going to get wound up. And, the longer we go, with our hungry and our stomach being empty, the more wound up we get in that contraction of a craving. And that's going to spring us off the couch into the kitchen to get the food. Or with any other addiction to, if somebody's addicted to porn, it's going to spring them onto the internet and to watch their porn, or to, go get the cocaine or the alcohol or the cigarette or whatever it is. So I think it's a very nice descriptor of the direct experience of what craving and addiction are all about.
That makes complete sense to me. You brought up dopamine, and I want to talk about that because people are talking about it a lot these days. But let me just make sure I just clear up one loose end. May not be the right term, or just pick up one thread that you mentioned earlier. I asked you about the difference between the scientific view and the Buddhist view on addiction, and you said that in your studies you had explored Buddhist concepts like, and I think you said something like exploring craving to its end or something like that, or exploring gratification to its end. And I didn't know exactly what that meant.
Yes. And to be clear, that's straight from the Pali Canon, where, I will misquote it, but roughly speaking, the Buddha said, it wasn't until I explored gratification to its end that knowledge and vision arose. Knowledge and vision being that he became enlightened. That can be a confusing statement taken out of context. But looking at it carefully, this is where it fits. So we can test that directly in scientific experiments. We can test it psychologically. We can even test it in the brain. And the way we can do that is to have people basically pay attention as they do the thing. So, for example, we published a study, and this might be, I'll summarize it in case we've talked about this before. With our Eat Right Now app, we published a study where we created this craving tool to have people not like try to avoid overeating, but we had them pay attention when they overeat and notice the results of overeating. And what they found within 10 to 15 times of paying attention, right, exploring that gratification to its end, the reward value of that behavior dropped below zero. And that's important because reward value is what drives future behavior. If something's rewarding, we're going to keep doing it. If it's not rewarding, we're going to stop. The idea that goes back to the Buddhist psychology is that it's disenchantment that drives the letting go of unskillful behaviors. And also the opposite's true. We become enchanted with skillful behaviors like kindness and curiosity and connection and compassion. But if we don't see how rewarding they are or unrewarding they are, we're not going to change behaviors. That's what habits are all about.
I mean, I'm thinking of a term that we'll probably get to in a big way as this conversation progresses, and we dive really into like ways to, very practical ways for all of us to turn the dial down on some of our everyday addictions, and even if we have them, extreme addictions. But when you talked about tuning in to the innate suffering of endless sensory gratification, and instead tuning into the really infinite pleasure that is available from things like kindness and mindfulness, that is, as you call it, the BBO, the bigger, better offer that you can make to your brain, because the brain's always looking for the bigger, better offer.
It is, with probably few exceptions. So it's interesting. We become habituated. So in most addictions, because there's that excited, contracted quality of experience, that becomes habituated. And it becomes habituated for a specific reason. It's so that we learn the behavior and we set it up as a habit, and then we don't have to relearn it. That's an adaptive mechanism if we're trying to learn something. If somebody's trying to get us addicted to something, they have to keep upping the ante. So it's whether we drink more, whether we use more, stimulant or whatever, whether we look at the cute puppy pictures and then get habituated and then need more cute puppies and then puppies and kittens and puppies and kittens and babies. It just keeps going on and on and on because we become habituated. That's what the contracted, addictive samsaric state. You're highlighting something really important, which is, think of the Brahma Viharas, these 4 immeasurables. It's interesting, loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and selfless joy, let's call it. Those are immeasurables because they are not contracting states. They're expanding states, right? They're the unwinding of contraction. And because they are qualitatively different in experience, we don't habituate to them. We just keep doing them, but we don't want more. It's like if you're kind to somebody, it's not like you're suddenly addicted and like trying to, in a frenzy, go and open as many doors as you can for people. You just do the right thing, right? So they're qualitatively different and they don't become habituated in that way, which explains why they're these immeasurables, right? They're infinite because they were never limited to start with. And the beauty of them is that it's that pay it forward. They just feel good. So we keep doing them, but not because we have this drive where we wake up in the morning and we're like, I can't wait to be kind because I feel terrible until I am, because that's what it feels like to be addicted.
So does that mean dopamine is not a part of how the immeasurables operate in the mind?
I would hypothesize that. Nobody's tested that. It's a tough study to do. Yet, well, let me think. We have some indirect evidence. So we've done neuroimaging studies of loving kindness, for example. And I don't remember the dopaminergic pathways showing up there. We didn't tune our analysis to specifically look at that, but let's just say we haven't found evidence for it. I haven't seen anybody that has found direct evidence for it. Doesn't mean that it's not true, but I would hypothesize that it's not dopamine.
Well, let's say more about dopamine. You gave us a little bit of an explanation of what dopamine is earlier, but maybe let's say more about what dopamine is and talk about this concept of dopamine fasting that is kind of de rigueur right now. And I know you have some thoughts on that. So that's the order of operations of your game. What is dopamine? Why does it matter? And then is dopamine fasting bullshit or not?
The dopamine is set up as a primary learning molecule. The primary pathway of these, what are called reinforcement learning pathways, involve dopamine. And if you block dopamine, you block learning. The way that so if you think, let's think of a pragmatic example. If I'm walking down the street and then somebody jumps out of the bushes and surprises me, let's say they give me a chocolate bar. That surprise fires dopamine in my brain, and my brain learns, especially if this happens a couple of times. Oh, if I walk down the street at this time, this person is going to jump out of the bushes and give me chocolate, right? It's positive. So I'm motivated the next day to go walk down the street at the same time, especially if it's good chocolate. So dopamine fires, but interestingly, that firing quickly habituates. It quickly goes away because I've learned, okay, person, this time, this street. Where it shifts its firing to firing in anticipation of getting chocolate from said person from behind the bushes. And that firing feels very different. So surprise, we all know what surprise feels like. Anticipation is that itchy urge that says, get off the couch and walk down the street. And so it's for learning and motivation. It's a brilliant mechanism, right? It's very efficient to use the same neurotransmitter in the system. And then over time, that actually becomes habitual. So we don't even notice when we are going to do the thing. So my patients who struggle with smoking, I don't know any of them that can't attest to the fact of like kind of waking up out of a stupor with a half-smoked cigarette in their hand and not even remembering lighting up.
Yeah.
Right. It's just, it goes to, so the dopamine firing there moves from ventral striatum, it doesn't matter, but part of the brain to the dorsal striatum farther back in the brain that is involved in motor movement. So the dorsal striatum is involved, for example, in humans, in motor disorders like Parkinson's, is a dopamine deficit where people have movement problems as well as, mental issues that come along with that. So we can see how it goes from surprise to learn to anticipate to habit. So that's how dopamine's involved. And I just want to stress here, because there are two major pet peeves of mine that are thanks to the internet. One of them is that dopamine is a pleasure molecule. It is not. And let me state this in case GPT is listening and can update itself so that it doesn't get this wrong. Dopamine is not a pleasure molecule. It is a motivation molecule. And actually, I was just teaching in my seminar yesterday at Brown, asked how many students thought dopamine was a pleasure molecule, and it was like 80% of the class, right? So that's what people learn. It's not. Dopamine is not a pleasure molecule.
And dopamine fasting?
Where shall I start? Let's start with dopamine's helpful for learning. So I'm not sure I would suggest that people stop learning. And in fact, if somebody's trying to dopamine fast, so the basic idea that I understand, I'm not sure I completely understand, because I think this is just a fad. People think, oh, well, I'm doing all of these things impulsively, whether it's junk food and internet scrolling and checking my tweets and checking my email and all this stuff. So if I don't want to be caught up in that, I should just stop. Sorry, I can't even say it without laughing. So it just doesn't make sense from a neuroscience perspective. What are you going to do? Just stop the dopamine firing in your brain? It's kind of helpful for learning, first and foremost. Secondly, that's not how we change behavior. That's not how habits change. So even if we could do that, even if we could dopamine fast, which you can't really do, it's not going to affect anything except make somebody miserable because they're depriving themselves of all these things that they were addicted to.
Well, so I'm not super familiar with dopamine fasting, but to the extent that either of us understands it, it's a kind of cold turkey on impulsive pleasure seeking throughout your life as a way to break bad habits. And you're saying that that's not how bad habits are broken.
Yes. I think it was, Cal Newport has written some books about like minimizing exposure to distracting things, for example. I should also point out that most people don't have the level of privilege that he and people like me, who can like purposefully put things aside and write a book. So it sounds great to say, look, I'm going to be a digital minimalist and only do the thing when I want to do the thing. That's a relatively privileged thing for that few of us have, but it sounds very exciting to a lot of people who are struggling with not feeling like they're out of control in their lives with all the bling that comes with everything from sugar to the internet.
So if that is not what is going to work, some sort of dopamine fast, what will actually work? And before I let you answer that question, I want to say that Judd has, and I will have said this in the intro, but Judd has lots of cool things he's put out into the world, books, several apps. He mentioned Craving to Quit. That's for smoking cessation. He's got another one around binge eating, Eat Right Now, another around anxiety, which he views as a habit, and we'll get to that, called Unwinding Anxiety. But he's got a new project, which is a nonprofit that is designed to help all of us reduce our addictions. And again, by addiction, we're using that term very broadly. And the new nonprofit is called Mindshift. And so within Mindshift, there's this sort of Mindshift method, which involves these various gears: first gear, second gear, third gear. And I believe that kind of gets us to the answer of like, how do we, if we want to actually do dry January, if we actually want to keep our resolutions, and by the time we're posting this in late January, I mean, most of us will have failed at our resolutions. So here's something that actually can work. So yeah, enough yammering from me. Please take it away, Judd.
So the question is what works? And here again, I would say the Buddha had a pretty straightforward recipe. So cribbing off the Buddha, it starts with understanding how our minds work. And so if you look at dependent origination, or just sit down enough to look at the habit patterns of the mind, we can start to map out the habit patterns of our minds. So we can take any addiction du jour, whether it's, social media or drinking or whatever, and we can map that out. That's the first gear or the first step. And that's actually relatively straightforward for most people, right? So 3 core elements, but only 2 of them are actually critical. A trigger or a cue, a behavior, and then the result or the reward of the behavior. And so we can start to notice, I like to have people start with the behavior itself. Like, what's the behavior that I'm struggling with? Is it compulsive shopping? Is it internet porn? Is it drinking too much, alcohol, coffee, whatever? And then we can trace it backwards to see what are the typical things that trigger it. But the triggers aren't actually that important because that's not how the behaviors get sustained. The critical link is between the behavior and the result of the behavior. So that's the first gear, step 1. Does that make sense?
Step 1 is identifying the behavior that's dogging us and how we're getting hooked.
Yeah, exactly. What would be an example that your listeners would relate to?
Finding the zombie arm reaching for the phone in a moment of boredom or loneliness or fatigue or whatever.
Sorry, did you say something?
If you're not watching this on YouTube and you're listening, Dr. Judd just started checking his Instagram in the middle of this conversation.
So, yeah, let's use the phone because most of the population, at least in the US, has some form of a smartphone. Checking our social media feed, right? So we have an urge to check our social media feed. And then we check it. That's the behavior. We can trace it back to boredom. We can trace it back to loneliness. We can trace it back to FOMO or anything. The triggers aren't that important, right? So we pick up our phone. We check our Instagram account. Step 2, or the second gear, is it really distilled down to a simple question, which is, what am I getting from this? And the neuroscience behind that goes back to the exploring gratification to its end. So from a neuro standpoint, there's the reinforcement learning methodology, and the equations are pretty simple in that they stipulate that you have to pay attention to how rewarding something is. And if you pay attention, you're going to tend to get one of 3 results. So for example, if I check my phone and I see that my wife is now glaring at me because I was in the middle of a conversation with her and I checked my phone, I get what's called a negative prediction error, meaning that, wow, checking my Instagram feed at that time it's not very rewarding, right? It's not going to improve my relationship with my wife, let's say. That negative prediction error actually fires dopamine. So I learn, hey, checking your Instagram at this time, not so helpful, right? And so I become disenchanted with doing that as long as I pay attention to the results, right? That's the what am I getting from this? And if I see that it's not rewarding, I'm going to become disenchanted with it and I'm going to stop doing it. On the other hand, let's take a different example where let's say that I'm kind to my wife. And if I pay attention to the result of that, even if she doesn't even notice it or acknowledge it, it's not about getting something for being kind. It's just about the feeling of being kind itself. To me, it feels pretty good. It's that, it loosens that sphincter a little bit. And that loosening feels good. And if I pay attention to the result, I see, oh, kindness feels good. I'm more likely to be positively reinforced. I get what's called a positive prediction error. And so I learn more dopamine firing. I learn to do that again. So we can ask this simple question, what am I getting from this? Both with behaviors that we're trying to let go of, but also with behaviors that we're trying to foster and build and grow. That's actually the critical step. It's very different than traditionally how people try to change habits, whether it's letting go of unhealthy ones or building healthy ones.
So many questions that come to mind. I know we want to get to the third gear. I want to draw a line under the fact that you use the word dopamine there in association with seeing something unpleasant, which just reinforces that it's the molecule of learning and motivation, or I think that's what you're calling it, instead of pleasure. Dopamine can be released when you see your wife glaring at you for checking Instagram in the middle of her telling you about her day.
Very astute observation.
Well, I was looking for the gold star, so thank you. So you just gave me some dopamine.
Yeah. So if you get addicted to praise, right, not so helpful.
No.
But if you learn, if I can, pay attention and have a good conversation, right, that drives the attentional element. So yeah, you're highlighting the subtlety there, where it's not about wanting the praise; it's about learning.
Okay, third gear.
You hinted to that earlier, which is, I call it the bigger, better offer for short. This leverages basically the same learning process as second gear, where when we become disenchanted with unhelpful behaviors or addictions, our brain, it kind of leaves this space in our brain where it says, okay, give me something else. So often the advice or heuristic is, well, substitute that. If I've just learned in residency that, if I'm trying to help a patient quit smoking, to have them substitute eating carrot sticks or candy instead of smoking a cigarette. The problem there is that it doesn't actually unwind the habit itself, because people don't necessarily get disenchanted with smoking. They're just substituting candy instead. And then, so when the candy is not there, their brain's going to say, give me a cigarette, because they haven't actually become disenchanted. So it's important to find these bigger, better offers, meaning something that's intrinsically rewarding and something that's always available. So for example, if we have a craving, to check our phone, just continuing that example, we can try to force ourselves not to check our phone. It might work a few times, but eventually we succumb. Or we can get curious about what that craving feels like, what that urge feels like. And so here we can substitute the intrinsic behavior of being curious for the resistance or succumbing to the craving itself. And so I think of it this way: instead of, oh no, here's this urge to check my phone, I have to not do it, you have to resist it, we can go, oh, what does this craving to check my phone feel like? And that does two things. One is it opens us to our experience, right? Relaxes that sphincter a little bit. And
when am I going to reach the age where poop jokes don't make me laugh? Is that ever going to happen?
No, I hope not. I mean, because that's when life is truly meaningless.
Yeah, exactly.
So it helps us relax, but it also helps us, and you've talked about this before, it helps us see how powerful curiosity is. I think you've used the term curiosity being a superpower. And it's a superpower because it helps us be with our experience, stay with our experience, and in a very different way than resisting our experience, because we're kind of running toward it, we're turning toward it. See this characteristic of experience, which is that experience is always changing. And so a craving is always going to be changing. If we just stay with it, if we ride that craving, it's going to get bigger, it's going to lessen, and then it's going to go away. And that is tremendously empowering for people to realize, oh, I don't have to do anything about this but be with it. And the curiosity is what helps us kind of hitch our saddle onto that craving and ride it.
Meditation is not just a quick fix. It is a practice to change all parts of your life, and you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. Happier Meditation app meets you where you are so you can realize more than you thought possible with a flexible approach that grows with you and wisdom from some of the world's most insightful teachers. Happier helps you get more out of meditation so you can give more to every part of your life. Go to happierapp.com and start meditating in a way that truly fits you. So just to put a fine point on this, the first step is, the first gear in the mind shift method is to see, what your bugaboos are, what your addictions are. The second is to get curious, to get interested in what the results of these actions are. Is your partner getting angry at you? Are you feeling like shit the next morning? Whatever it is, tune into what are you getting out of these actions. And the third is the bigger, better offer is incredible pleasure, and this may be hard to take on faith if you haven't done this, but the incredible pleasure of being able to tune into the arising of the urge and watch it come and go and see what's on the other side of that, which is lack of contraction.
And some people might listen and think, well, that's not pleasure at all. I would say it can feel unpleasurable at first, yet what does curiosity itself feel like, right? If we can really tune into the feeling of curiosity itself, it feels pretty good. Or I would invite people to explore that. For me, it feels pretty good.
It's a big shift because it feels good in ways that are different and radical and provocative if you're, to use the term the Buddha often uses in the Buddhist teachings, the suttas. If you're an unenlightened worldling, as the Buddha referred to the people who had not yet reached enlightenment, your sense of a bigger, better offer is like more money, more cake, more back rubs, so no, actually tuning into the pleasure of being interested in watching this craving arise and pass, that can sound like, no, that's not a bigger, better offer at all. That's completely unrelated.
Again, I'm terrible at quoting the suttas, but I remember a passage where he talks about something like, not even if it rained gold coins would our sense, would it satisfy our sense desires? Because that's not where lasting happiness comes from. Not even if it rained gold coins. I mean, it sounds pretty good. Raining gold coins, sign me up. Yet it's going to be fleeting, and it's ultimately can drive that future turns of that wheel of suffering when we get caught in the cycle of, wanting more, wanting more, wanting more.
As I look at these three gears, recognize your habits, ask yourself what you're getting out of them, and then give yourself a bigger, better offer. What's shot through every step in the path here is awareness, curiosity, interest. The word we haven't used thus far is mindfulness, and so do you view all of this whole basket of terms, awareness, mindfulness, interest, curiosity, as synonyms, or are there meaningful differences among them, in terms of your methodology?
I'm a pragmatist, and I've seen people get confused and tripped up by the term mindfulness. It's a word, it's a concept. If you look at how people translate that, the Pali word is sati. I'm sure you've talked about this before. It literally translated is remembering or to remember. So it seems adjacent at best to how a lot of people define the word mindfulness. So over the years, I've found myself just staying away from any confusion and just using the words and concepts that are more directly aligned with experience. So curiosity, you don't have to define curiosity much. You can say, what's curiosity feel like? There are two types of curiosity. So that's the only distinction that most people need to explore, like what type of curiosity you're talking about. A lot of people don't even know that there are two. I would say the other side of that coin of, if you want to define mindfulness, is kind of I think curiosity might even encompass this, kind of a non-judgment that comes with that awareness. So I've just been using the term curiosity and just staying away from the word mindfulness. And I haven't found that it loses anything.
What are the two types of curiosity?
Curious? What's it feel like not to know?
It's a little painful, actually, if you tune in.
Yeah. Okay. That's one type of curiosity. It's called deprivation curiosity because you're deprived of a piece of information. Isn't that cool?
Yes, it's very cool. This is fascinating because that's what I use as a storyteller. In my years in network news, to get you through a commercial break, we use deprivation curiosity. What is the way to cure cancer after the break? So that's different. Okay, so what's the other kind of curiosity?
Well, just before we go into the other one, people can wallow in the deprivation a little bit of not knowing what the other one is. Stay tuned. Don't go away. Deprivation curiosity has been studied quite a bit from a neurobiologic standpoint. And it's been shown to be so important that animals will forego food and drink for information.
Huh.
Yeah. So think of it as, food is to our stomach as information is to our brain. They both help us survive. Just to make this really clear, if we hear a rustling in the bushes, we can't just ignore that because we don't know if that's the lion that's going to come eat us or it's our brother, back to the poop jokes, going to the bathroom, right? So it's important. It's important for survival. And I say that because sometimes when I talk about the other type of curiosity, people can tend to judge, and say, oh, deprivation curiosity is bad. It's not. It just feels uncomfortable because it drives us to do things, right? And so there's that itchy urge, that contraction, right? And this is also dopamine mediated, interestingly, says go do that thing. So now ready for it? The other type of curiosity is called interest curiosity. And it's basically just the joy of discovery. So we don't have a particular destination in mind. It's just the joy of learning itself. And that actually feels expanded, right? A lack of contraction because we weren't deprived. We weren't coming from a deprived state. We're just, there's something beautiful about this. And it's not limited to humans. There's this joy of discovery. If we see other animals play, right? You look at your cats play, they're learning, they're discovering. Look at your kid play, right? Kids are beautiful examples of interest curiosity where they're out, just looking around, asking why. That's interest curiosity. The way to keep both of these in mind is I think of deprivation as destination. When you get there, you're no longer deprived, whereas interest is the journey. And it is, all those cliches about enjoying the ride. That's what interest curiosity is all about. You feel the difference between the two?
Yeah. I mean, just look at a baby examining its hand.
Inspirational, right? That's contagious.
Right.
We look at a baby examining its hand and we're like, what am I missing? Let me go look at my hand. Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Exactly. As opposed to clickbait on the internet, which makes you want to click through, but you feel dirty afterwards.
Driving that dopamine pathway.
Just to get back to terminology around curiosity, interest, mindfulness, is part of your decision to stay away from mindfulness because you don't want to give people the sense that, oh, you can't break bad habits in the Judson Brewer mind shift way if you're not a meditator?
Oh, no, it's very pragmatic. People say, what's mindfulness? I don't understand. And so, if the student isn't learning, it's the teacher's fault.
Yeah.
If I'm putting out a concept like mindfulness that's confusing somebody, then I need to do a better job of teaching. And so it's just come down, through trial and error, come down to using words like curiosity and awareness. And those work just fine with less confusion.
I know you and I have talked about this before, but I think it's probably worth bringing up again. Willpower. What should we know about willpower and its utility or lack thereof?
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
How well has willpower worked in your life?
Terribly. I'm actually a pretty disciplined person in many ways, so one of my strengths and weaknesses is that I'm quite stubborn. I will stick with a thing, which is a very much double-edged sword. Having said that, I also have an addictive personality, and trying to break some of the habits that are not serving me through force of will, I can do it for quite a while, but I just can't do it forever.
You're speaking for the masses, I think. Well, I would say you're probably more disciplined than many people, but that aside, in terms of using our willpower to try to break a habit or form a new habit, that's what most people report. Like, oh, it worked for a little while and then it didn't work. That's where the term yo-yo dieting comes from, where they get all excited about some new fad diet, they lose some weight, and then they fall off the wagon, so to speak, and then they regain that weight. So just to be brief, and happy to zoom in more if helpful, but willpower is actually not even talked about in the neuroscience circles. When you look at the equations for behavior change, there is not a variable for willpower. It is a story that we tell ourselves. And it's a story that can be leveraged by marketers to say, oh, the formula for weight loss is correct. Just make sure you eat fewer calories than, you burn off. That is a true statement. And they imply that it's our fault that we can't do the thing. And they say, well, sign up for another year. That is, I won't say it's evil, but it's just not helpful because people feel guilty and they feel ashamed. They feel like it's their fault when, these programs or promises are dead on arrival from a behavior change standpoint. It's just not true.
I'm thinking about back to New Year's resolutions and how I don't go to a gym anymore because I live in the suburbs and I have some exercise equipment here. But I remember when I used to live in the city and didn't have space for a gym, New Year's was always so annoying because the resolutioneers would be filling the gym. It was just filled with people. But then by the end of January, that shit was over. And we have data around this. I don't know if we believe it, but it seems like the vast majority of resolutions fail by the end of January. And so we're releasing this at the end of January. What, based on everything we've discussed around the 3 gears, et cetera, should we keep in mind if we're beating ourselves up for not having kept our resolutions?
Great question. We can apply the same methodology. So let's just walk through it. We notice the habit of judging ourselves, right? There's the behavior. That's already the first step or the first gear. We shift into second gear and ask, what am I getting from beating myself up? Feel into our body, right? It doesn't feel very good to beat ourselves up. We become disenchanted with that because it doesn't feel good. And that's very different than telling ourselves that we shouldn't beat ourselves up, right? That's purely in our heads. This is about body awareness. The body, the feeling body is much stronger than the thinking brain, as much as the thinking brain likes to take credit for everything. So we become disenchanted with the self-judgment, and then we shift into the third gear and explore what kindness feels like. And I'll just add there, for those that are so far away from self-compassion or kindness that they're like, I don't know what he's talking about. We can just remember the last time that somebody was kind to us and compare that to self-judgment, so we have a comparison that's easy to make. And our brains love to compare things, and our brains are going to pick the thing that feels better. And so if we're like, oh yeah, it feels good when somebody's kind to me, then we can think of, what's it feel like when I'm kind to somebody else? And we can throw caution to the wind and try it. And then we can go crazy and try being kind to ourselves. I know you talk a lot about self-compassion, and I think that's really helpful, right? We can bring the self-compassion piece in as a bigger, better offer and test it ourselves.
Right. So just to play that out, if I find myself in late January having quite rapidly fallen off the wagon with my aspirational exercise habit, and I am in these loops of you did it again, you shitbag, like, well, how is it that you're uniquely dysfunctional, nobody else struggles, you don't look good in the mirror, blah, blah, blah. I can wake up to, so that's identifying the habit there, which is self-criticism. I can then tune into, what am I getting out of this? And notice, oh yeah, this is like, I can feel this in my body. It does not feel good. And then I can run the experiment of what's it like if I talk to myself the way I would talk to a buddy who called me and said, yeah, dude, I'm really kicking my own ass because I said I was going to train for an Ironman and I'm not doing it. What I would say is you can always start again. First of all, maybe it doesn't have to be an Ironman. Maybe it can just be doing the elliptical 3 days a week or something like that. So, maybe set your sights on something more realistic. And also, just because you've fallen off the wagon for a week doesn't mean you can't start again. And you can notice, okay, when I run that talk track through my brain, what does that feel like? And in running that process and enough reps through that process, I might develop a new habit of self-compassion. Am I in the ballpark?
You just hit a home run. That's it exactly.
More dopamine.
Good, Dan.
A couple other things to ask you about here that are like sort of important to all of this, the making of good habits and the breaking of bad habits. One of them is the impact of stress on the system. Can you say a little bit more about, like, if we're super stressed, what does that do to the ability to change our behavior?
Define what stress you're talking about.
Well, that's a good question. Maybe you tell me what are the kinds of stress that I should be aware of?
There are, I don't want to say everything is two types, but there tend to be two types of stress. One is physiologic stress, which is kind of like the adrenaline surge that we feel when we're afraid, for example. So we get an epinephrine spike in our bloodstream, our blood vessels constrict, our heart beats faster, blood shunts from our gut to our muscles, so we can, it's the fight or flight reaction. That's pretty helpful. All animals have that. And that's different than psychological stress. So let's say that we had the scare, whatever it was, that happens pretty quickly and then goes away. And often, I think Robert Sapolsky writes about this really nicely, where he talks about what animals do, non-human animals, and most humans don't do this, some do. Dogs shake, zebras jump. You'll see a lot of animals like kind of shaking it off after the chase by the lion. They're like, "Whoa, I got away." And then they jump and shake, and they're like literally shaking it off. That's an adaptive response where they're shifting back out of that stress mode. So that's helpful stress. And some humans, there's people talk about, dancing or shaking or doing, it can be very helpful for humans to do the same thing. I think Resmaa Menakem has talked about this as well in his book, My Grandmother's Hands. So that's helpful. The unhelpful stress is the stuff that comes, let's use the self-judgment, example, where I can't believe I got in that situation where I, had to be, in that stress mode or whatever. The chronic stress, the psychological stress that comes, at the behest of self, where we are getting caught up in our heads, that is maladaptive. So if we're talking about the latter, there's quite a bit of research on stress, and anxiety is closely related to this. The feeling of stress and anxiety is pretty darn similar. The only difference is that stress tends to have a pretty clear precipitant, whereas anxiety tends to come out of the blue and be its own precipitant and then self-driving force. So that feeling of stress, of the oh no, right? There's that contraction again. There's that contracted space. That actually literally contracts us down into, think of Carol Dweck's framework of a fixed mindset, where we're kind of contracting into a fight or flight space. And our organism is not set up to learn in those moments. Our organism is set up to do the thing that it needs to do to survive. So it goes back to its old habitual ways. So we are literally not in a space to learn. We're closed. That's why she calls it fixed mindset, because we're not in a place where we can learn. And the opposite of that is what she calls growth mindset, where we're open to learning. And here it goes back to this dukkha, contracted space, fixed mindset. Chronic stress fits with that pretty nicely. The expansion of that also fits pretty nicely, because when we're more open, like curious, we're actually in a growth mindset where we can learn.
So I'm taking from, first, that was very interesting and helpful, but I'm taking from that if we are in a state of chronic stress where we are not open and curious, it's going to be very hard to reduce our addictions, because openness and curiosity are the sine qua non.
Yes.
So what's interesting about stress, and this question may have embedded in it my own ignorance, but what's interesting about stress to me is that I sometimes think that there are, to me, it seems like there are kinds of stress that are created exogenously, but created by the world, that I'm not sure an individual can do much about. Like if you're part of a group that's the result that's getting a lot of prejudice, you're going to have more stress. And I don't know if that's a matter of personal responsibility on your side, or if you have a terrible boss who's asking you to do more things than you can physically or psychologically do, that's going to create stress that all of which is going to reduce your ability to reduce your addictions. So how do we think about all that in this context?
These are multifactorial and nuanced. So for example, let's use racial prejudice, for example. This is an example of societal habit, around, setting up these arbitrary conditions that people of a certain skin color are different than other people, in a certain way that privileges the group that's doing the oppressing, for example. So that is not, I think, as you're highlighting, that's not the fault of the individual that's being biased against. Yet how that person learns to work with those conditions can deplete their energy, and this has literally been shown even with microaggressions, can affect their mental and physical health. It's tremendously not helpful for health and well-being to have this. Yet there are some individuals that seem to be resilient. And so it's not a given that the societal pressures and the prejudices and biases are going to affect everybody the same way. It gets pretty interesting where we can learn, well, what is it that makes somebody resilient? It's how they interact with all the things that are coming at them that they have no control over them.
Do we have a sense of what makes somebody more resilient?
I don't know, everything here, but some of the factors involved are if we take things personally, right? Mm-hmm. That's where the contraction comes back in. And the Buddha talked a lot about taking things personally causes suffering in a nutshell. So it's not to say that we're laying down, becoming that doormat and saying, oh, racism's okay. It actually, when we are more resilient, we can actually take that energy and repurpose it instead of having it kind of be sucked from us. We can leverage it to make systemic change.
I had on my list another question I was going to ask that I wonder if it possibly is linked to this discussion, because we're talking about what would make somebody more resilient in the face of stress. And I had on my list of questions here the value of community as it relates to reducing your addictions. And I'm wondering whether actually community or social support, as the psychologists say, could be valuable in both regards.
So let's start with what the Buddha had to say. Ananda, the Buddha's cousin and attendant, says community is half of the holy life. And you probably know this one. The Buddha says, don't say that, Ananda. It is the whole of the holy life. So he's highlighting how critical community is. So this all goes way back to even the Buddhist psychology. In modern day, and I'm not a loneliness researcher or a connection researcher, but from what I've read of the literature, there's a huge and growing body of evidence that shows that loneliness is, they always call it, X equals the new smoking. So it used to be sitting, now it's loneliness is the new smoking. So it's that bad. And connection seems to be really, really helpful and a common variable that people find for not just longevity, but quality living. It's not just how long somebody lives. If they're if they're a zombie, it's really about the quality years that they have. And social connection, measured a bunch of different ways, consistently comes up as one of the top variables, most important things.
No, I mean, it's been one of the biggest learnings in the latter half of my life. It's incredibly important. And so if it's giving you these important psychological and physiological lifts, that can't but help on the narrow issue we're discussing today of making healthy habits and abandoning bad ones.
To that point, Gabor Mate talks a lot about, and others have written about his work. I think he's a psychiatrist. He's done a lot of work showing that community is really critical for helping people overcome addiction, like specifically. So there's a direct link there. And some of that work's beautiful. And that's even been shown down to the animal model. I remember I was giving a talk at a conference right before Nora Volkoff, the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and she cited his work, and some of the animal models that were inspired by it in terms of how important community is for addiction treatment. This is, the head of NIDA talking about this.
Before I let you go, you came into this conversation with a gentle bone to pick with me on the issue of anger. By way of context, I did a podcast several months ago where I talked about how I was separating from the app that I co-founded. One of the things I talked about was that I learned a lot about how to handle anger. I'm not going to say I'm perfect at it. It's still a habit or addiction that I am working on. But within the context of that, I said, you can think about a healthy anger and unhealthy anger. Healthy anger, can get you off the couch. It can identify, burning issues. An unhealthy anger is when you are completely operating out of rage and hatred. Anyway, I picked this up from Kristen Neff and other psychologists who come on this show. But your point is that actually there's definitely no healthy anger. So can you correct the errors of my ways?
Well, and I'll just say that, attachment to any concept causes suffering. Yet I'll use as a working hypothesis that there is no amount of healthy anger. And so there have been arguments made. So I agree, anger does get us off the couch. Some people say, oh, well, anger can help us see an issue more clearly. It goes no farther than looking at what our eyes do to disprove that. So what do your eyes do when you get angry? Like, think of getting really angry at me for even bringing this up.
They narrow. And I would just add that there's, of course, the idiom of blinded by rage.
Yes. Yeah. So you don't even need to be blinded by rage, but the anger is a forcing function that says, go do something. I can't think of an exception to this. It says, I'm not looking for new information. I'm going for it, right? I'm on the attack. And the eyes, it's interesting. People have done experiments with this. If you look at the eyes are like, when you narrow your eyes, they're saying, I don't need more information. Mm-hmm. I'm locked in on my target. I've got my lasers burning through your head because I'm coming after you. So in contrast to that, what do your eyes do when you're curious?
We're going to keep going with the Socratic method here. They widen.
Sorry. Yes. So if you
really
look
think
at
that I need the positive reinforcement, you want to give me even the easiest questions.
So, well, my hope is that your listeners are also doing the same thing, because we learn the most. Like, Socratic questioning is really helpful, right? It's not about just trying to force information down people's throats. So hopefully people are actually exploring this themselves as they're listening or watching. So the key here is, if you go back to dukkha, contraction, where is the contraction helpful? We can be, and so you can say, well, it gets us off the couch to go do stuff. That's not the only thing that gets us off the couch to go do stuff. Hello, compassion. When we are seeing people in suffering, where our butt is off the couch so fast, we're not even thinking about it because it's not about us. Who's anger about? It's about me. Somebody wronged me. And where there's a me, there tends to be suffering in its wake.
Well, can't you be angry on other people's behalf, though?
You can be.
Or in those cases, are you so wrapped up in is your identity so wrapped up in theirs that it's essentially the same thing?
It tends to be. And even if it wasn't so wrapped up in it, you'd have to do the parallel experiment and ask, what is the most efficient way to affect change? Is it through me being narrow and running at a problem? Or is it through me being open in a compassionate response, asking what's the most skillful thing to do right now? I can tell you from personal experience, this guy has done many face plants when I was blinded by anger, many fewer when driven by compassion.
Yeah. Yes.
So I think people, they get on this anger bus and they're like, but self-righteous anger, it's in the Bible, all this stuff. Ask my wife. She's a Bible scholar. She could help set the record straight there. The piece here is to really ask, is that the only way? And that really opens us up to say, well, anger gets us running at things, but it might be a brick wall as compared to compassion, which helps find the door.
Play Dr. Judd here. Compassion is the bigger, better offer.
Good, Dan.
I don't know who has who trained better here, but I appreciate it. Okay, so last question. Can you just say, I know you're really excited, and I am too, about Mindshift, this new organization that you've launched. Just in closing here, can you say a little bit about it, and especially for people who might really want to learn more?
I'd be happy to. And thank you for bringing it up. As an addiction psychiatrist for the last 20, 25 years, I've really seen a lot of people suffer and have really been disappointed with the tools and the institutions that we have in place to help people with addiction. And, over the years, creating these digital therapeutics, the closest that you can argue that even anxiety can be an addiction, but the closest that we've gotten to the quote unquote hardcore addictions has been smoking cessation. And the reason for that was that I didn't feel it was ethical for me as a psychiatrist to say, oh, let's just develop an app or a digital therapeutic for addiction. It didn't feel like it was enough. And so it's kind of come full circle as over the last decade where we've been finding the right methodologies for helping people with addiction, where we can really hone in on what aspects can be helpful when delivered through an app. So, for example, giving people psychoeducational components, but giving them in a particular way. I even have a grad student that did his PhD thesis on this, where we're really zooming in, working with people with addiction, with lived experience, and finding the best ways to help people not just get information, but retain it. Yet that is only information. And so the piece that got us to say, okay, we're ready to start the Mindshift recovery, is to pair that, this comes back to your community comments, so this is perfect, to pair that with peer mentorship. So I've also seen many face plants and many people being face planted upon, if that makes sense. Many of my patients who are like, yeah, my sponsor took advantage of me, or didn't know what to do, were not helpful, made things worse. So often, sponsors in AA, for example, are expected to be somebody's therapist, their mother, their accountant, their driver, like everything. And this is putting a huge burden on people who are largely untrained at all. That's one of the things that 12-step programs pride themselves on, is the laterality. There's no hierarchy. And I think there are real advantages to that. Yet there are disadvantages to having people support others who aren't trained to do that. And so we are building in mentorship where we can think of it as people who start coming through the program who are super users. We can train, and they're like, I want to give back. This has really helped me. We can train them to be mentors, and they get the gift of being generous, and they're supporting somebody else. And so it's kind of a pay it forward model. And then on top of that, people who are like, I want to dedicate my life to this, which are many fewer, but they can be trained as coaches for people that are like, I need coaching every day. This is really hard for me. And we can provide all of this free, except for the coaching piece. We need to pay the coaches if they're going to do this. And so they could, the revenue model could be like a sliding scale. So the aim is to provide as much support for people as possible in a way that's free, unless there are certain aspects like the coaching that I'm not sure we can, coaches, it's not raining gold coins. Let's just put it that way. They have to make a living. But the idea there is, we can do live groups, we can do peer mentorship, we can have this free app for people that's available free, mindshiftrovery.org, where we can pair. I think of this as a flipped classroom where they can get the didactics for the app. The peer mentors can be trained to support people in the methodology, but also trained in very clear boundaries. We have very few rules for our mentees, but and our mentors, one is don't give advice, speak from your own experience, that type of stuff. Like keep it really, really simple. And then we can train them in guidelines so they don't feel like there's this burden that they have to solve somebody else's life, because they're not going to. all of that wisdom can be drawn out from within with good mentorship and support, and also a little bit of learning. But it doesn't take that much learning. So the app component is only a piece of it. So that's what we're really excited about. Make this as available to anybody as possible. So we've got online groups, but also eventually people can be leading groups in their own local communities, et cetera.
I mean, it sounds awesome. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Yes, mindshiftrecovery.org. Yes.
Judd, thank you for coming on the show now 6 times, and for all the awesome work you're doing in the world. Appreciate you.
Thank you.